important for our students to understand where learning takes place and who is responsible for learning. So in this lesson, we're going to take a quick look at the importance of understanding the difference between learning and teaching. We're going to start by looking at some theories of education. We're going to look at advantages and disadvantages of different learning styles. We're going to discuss the idea that education is active, not passive. We're going to recognize the roles of the teacher and the student in the process of learning, and we will introduce the California standards for the teaching profession, which is not to say the California standards for content. That's going to be a different lesson. So to recap what hopefully you already know about teaching, since if you're enrolled in this course, chances are you are seeking to be a teacher of social sciences. So teaching itself is fun. It just is. It's really the greatest employment you can have. It's the greatest career. There's a lot that's good about it. People complain, teachers complain, but ultimately we choose this career because we really enjoy doing it. So teaching is definitely fun. Economics is the best part of teaching, in my humble opinion. Economics is exciting. It's interesting. It's relevant. It's never been more relevant than it is right this moment in history. And so economics is just a fascinating content area to focus on. So what we can say then is that teaching economics is a combination of fun and exciting. I don't think there's any question about that. And I think you're going to have a lot of fun bringing it into your classroom, even in the K through 8 level. It won't look the same as it looks in college or in high school, but it will definitely have a huge impact and make your students better off. So let's start by looking at 4 theories of education. And before you think, oh, I'd better learn these are actually 4 ways not to do it, things to avoid. These are terrible ideas for teaching students, but you may recognize some of these in your own experience. And if you ever find yourself doing these things, you can have that moment of self-correction where you say, oops, I better watch out. This doesn't work. The first one is the buried treasure theory. And this is what it sounds like, where the teacher leaves it up to the student to discover what there is to learn. And so I don't know if you can see this very well, but the pirate up here, the teacher, is saying, I've really tricked them this time, ha, ha, ha. And the students are looking and looking. And you might see this sort of thing where a teacher just hands the students a ton of material and says, the onus is on you to learn and go for it. Go ahead and learn everything you can by digging and seeking knowledge. And that, as you probably have recognized in your own experience, doesn't work. Students need direction. They don't need knowledge crammed in their heads. That doesn't work. But in this case, making the knowledge accessible is a really important part of it. You may have noticed this, but throughout this course, at the beginning of each lesson, there are a set of objectives. One of the purposes of those objectives is to avoid this very problem, and that is, if I tell you in advance what it is I'm asking you to learn, then as you're going through the lesson, you can look for those very things. And that's one way you can avoid this problem with your students, is in many different ways, setting up objectives to let them know what it is they'll be learning, so that as they're learning it, they're not frantically digging through a ton of material. They're focusing their energy on understanding those things. The next theory is the sponge theory. And this is the idea that the teacher is just full of knowledge, and you can see down here that the students are just adorable little sponges ready to soak up that knowledge. And they are just in awe of the teacher. How did she get to be so smart? All of these things. Well, the problem with the sponge theory is that we're missing a really amazing opportunity. If you're the teacher, just being the fountain of wisdom, you're missing out on the fact that in front of you are little bundles of human capital, amazing bundles of human capital. When I say little, I don't mean this is necessarily the younger ages. Any age you teach, it's important to remember that in front of you are individuals with differently developed human capital, with different human capital, and they bring something valuable to the learning experience. And what you need to be ready to do is to draw on their experiences to help the entire class benefit from that. So never forget that in front of you are bundles of human capital ready to be explored, ready to grow, but also ready to contribute to the learning experience of everyone in the room. And you'll be amazed as a teacher what great information you get from your students, how much it helps everyone to draw from their knowledge base. The next one is exactly what you might think of, the steamroller theory. When you hear that, you might think, yep, that's kind of the experience I've had before. And it's just a covering of material. And this is going through the material in such a way that just gets it done. And I will tell you, as a teacher of 12th grade, economics, AP economics especially, that there have been times when I found myself doing this thinking, oh, I've got to get to the end of this. And this, of course, is part of the teaching experience. Don't expect to be perfect at this. However, one way you can help yourself avoid this is to pace the class in advance. So as much as possible, plan ahead so that you know what you're covering and when, so you don't find yourself at the end of a time period with a lot left to cover and then you give it short shrift as you run through it quickly. That can really do damage to the learning and the desire to learn. Your students know when they're being rushed, and the interest in learning can really dissipate at that point. The last one is the one monkey theory. And this is suggesting that all students have the same learning method. And this slide, I like this because it shows you that there are very different students you're going to encounter. You've got Marvin Tactile, and if you've ever met your tactile students, or you will know when you meet them, they have to touch things. And this is pretty common in boys. Boys tend to be quite tactile. They want to touch things. They want to, have these hands-on experiences that they really, they need somehow to connect with the material. And that's fine. But often those students are designated as bad, as ill-behaved. This is why we see a lot of boys being disciplined in schools at a disproportionate rate, because they tend to be more active and tactile. You've got the talker, right? Melinda Big Mouth, and that often tends to be girls more often than boys, and they talk a lot. And again, notice that these students are designated as somehow bad or undesirable. We want to avoid the temptation to see our students that way. What we want to do is recognize that they're different and that their different ways of being and learning are going to contribute to the classroom experience. So we see Melinda, the talker, and certainly we have students like that. We've got the visual learner. Again, notice that this student is identified as somehow a less capable student. So here's our visual learner that needs to see things and maybe see them over and over again to take in information that way. And then you've got the audio learner. And notice that this is our star pupil, because this pupil will sit quietly and listen and take in information and write it down, and that seems to be sufficient. So that's what we're going to see kind of historically as our ideal student. What we know now is that students learn differently. And it's a wonderful thing to recognize this in our students so that we can vary our lessons and our approaches in ways that reach Marvin and Melinda and Myron, and not just Myrna. We tend to idealize the student that will sit quietly and learn and marginalize our other students. And we definitely don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we teach our material in as many ways as we can do it. So we vary our teaching. We don't just stand and lecture all the time. And you'll notice in college, that is the typical mode. And what happens to you as a student? You tend to check out. You tend to have moments where your brain is elsewhere. You've missed something. You take notes and review them later. It's often very difficult to learn in that way. And whatever difficulties you suffer as a learner, remember that, because your students also have different learning methods and you want to be able to reach them. And there are lots of great things you can do. In this course, we're going to show you economics activities specifically that reach all different kinds of learners. But whatever you're teaching, you want to make sure that you have different ways of approaching it. And that doesn't mean you do 5 different lessons for 5 students. It means that you incorporate different things into your lesson. So Marvin Tactile might enjoy the simulation where you trade with one another and you learn about the benefits of trade by seeing it and experiencing it. Melinda might benefit from a group discussion about what it all meant. Myron might benefit from visual imagery, infographics, for example, that break down information. And all of this can work together to make you a better teacher, but we want to remember that students learn differently. So let's practice this a little bit on you. How good a student are you? And I want you to try this just for fun to see how it works. And I'm going to ask you a few questions to see if you can learn simple numbers, count, read, add, and connect the dots. So here we go. In the next slide, I'm going to give you about 10 seconds with it. I want you to count the F's, and then we'll continue on for the answer. So when you see this next slide, your job is to count the number of the letter F, the number of times you see the letter F. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so now that you've gotten your number of the letter F's, jot it down somewhere or commit it to memory. How many did you get? And let's see the answer. The answer is 6. There are 6 F's. Now, if you got a different result, it could be that you missed the F in of, or the F, in one of the finished files, probably not so likely. But you might have missed it in scientific or of. So those internal F's that don't stand out as, very meaningful often get overlooked. So if you miss this one, I don't want you to be too hard on yourself, but I do want you to consider, wow, maybe I am not as good a student as I always thought I was. So let's try another one. In the next 3 slides, I want you to read the slide. I'll give it to you for about 10 seconds. And then I want you to write down what they say, or you can just make a mental note. That's up to you. And then we'll go back and see how you did with it. So here we go. The first one. What does it say? So you can either write that down and make a mental note. Here's the next slide. Again, write it down or a mental note. And here's our third slide. So write it down or a mental note. Okay, so what did you get? Did you get this in your notebook? Did you notice that Paris in the spring is what it said? You may have thought that you saw Paris in the spring because your mind ignores that extra word that isn't necessary. Your brain does that for you. A bird in the hand, and once in a lifetime. So if you miss that, again, don't question your intelligence, but notice that your brain tricks you in some ways. Sometimes your brain has taught you to just ignore certain things. What that means then is not that you are not a good learner or not a capable learner. It means that you need to train your brain to do things a little bit differently. And that's what learning is. So let's try another little test of our learning ability with simple arithmetic. And I want you to go through as I go through each slide, I want you to just keep a running total and see how your answer matches up. So don't feel stressed. This is not an IQ test. This is simply a way of seeing how your brain processes information. So can you add? So add 1,020. And you should have gotten 1,020. Then add 1,000. So what do you get? 2,020, right? So let's add 20 more. 2,040. Add 1,000 more. 3,040. Add 40 more. 3,080. Add 1,000 more. 4,080. Add 20 more. And what do you get? Did you get 4,100? Or did your brain do what a lot of us do, which is skip straight to 5,000? So again, this is your brain ignoring some information and just kind of going in its own way. So if you got 5,000, which is what, just so you know, most people say 5,000. If you said 5,000 and that was your first response, don't think that you can't do math. Don't think that you are not a good learner. Just remember that your brain takes you places that you don't always intend for it to go. So one last little test, and this is just to see how much you know. Do you know basic geography? And this one is, how many oceans are there and what are they? So just for fun, I want you to try this one. This isn't a trick question, but see if you can identify the 4 oceans, and I'm going to tell you right now, there are 4, of the world, and see if you can name them. And what you'll see in all of this, by the way, I'm not going to give you the answers. I'm going to let you look that one up, but it's pretty basic. There are 4. And you might say, oh, there's 7 seas, because again, that's kind of our conventional knowledge, but there are actually 4 oceans. See if you can figure out what they are. So the message here might seem to be that you can't do it, that you just don't know things, you can't read, you don't know simple numbers, you don't know basic geography, you're just not that talented as a student. That might seem to you to be the message. Imagine the message our students get when they are struggling to learn things and they're making efforts, but they encounter mistake after mistake. And our job then is to understand this. Understand that teaching is easy. Standing on one side of the PowerPoint and saying, add this up, don't you know this? That's the easy part. The hard part is being the learner. So I didn't do this to damage your self-esteem. I do this to show you how hard it can be to be in the shoes of a learner, especially a learner who is having trouble with this, where your brain is playing tricks on you and the material is complex and requires a deeper level knowledge than you might be applying. So this is a good observation for teachers, is that learning is hard. Teaching can be easy. Once you have gotten the hang of it, once you've gone through that learning curve, and you will, the teaching part is easy. But what's expected of our students, we don't always realize this, is very, very hard. And you might think, oh, that's simple stuff. How could this be hard? And I'm guilty of this as well. Sometimes I'll say to my students, this isn't hard. And that is a terrible thing to say. What we don't want to do is minimize their effort. So keep this in mind, and if this made you feel terrible, don't use it to be mean to other people with, but use it as an opportunity to recognize that the learning process is filled with difficulty and that we should have empathy for our students. Now, our job then isn't to just teach, to stand by and hand this to students and say to them, gosh, this was easy. Why didn't you know this? Our job is to help students recognize how they learn. So if we give them something that challenges them, we can show them the process to find the correct answer. That math one, for example, if we say, okay, your brain went to 5,000, let's explore why it did that and how we can go about this differently. We can be really helpful to our students. Instead of playing a game of gotcha, which none of us want to do, of course, we want to make sure that we're helping our students to gain the knowledge in whatever way they can. So here's a few things to know about learning. And this is, as for future teachers or even current teachers, really important to keep in mind. Learning is not passive reception. It is not just sitting there taking it in. It is participation. It is effort. Learning is active. It requires that they be participating. And as such, you can think of your K-8 students and realize that they can't just be sitting there taking it in. That would not work for young people. It doesn't really work well for us as adults. It doesn't work well for young people. Students and not teachers are the major actors in the learning experience. So teachers, we have an important role. We put it out there, we facilitate, we guide, but the real effort has to come from our students. They have to be engaged, and it's our job to get them engaged. The challenge for teachers then is to motivate them to take control, take responsibility for their learning, and provide all possible means for student learning. That means we engage in discussion, we engage in demonstration, we engage in interaction, simulation, online modalities. Every possible way we can find to reach our students, we are constantly looking for that and looking for better ways too. We have to always be growing for our students to grow. If the majority of your students aren't learning, you need to investigate your teaching. And this is a really important way of keeping ourselves accountable. We need to constantly be watching what's going on. And there are formal assessments and there are informal assessments that we need to use. Informally, the best thing to do is looking at your students, to watch them, to see how their eyes light up, to see how they react to information. If you're not seeing learning in formal and informal ways, you need to take another look at how you're presenting material. There are some great stories that go along with this. You're going to read Miss Nelson is Missing, which is a wonderful story about the influence of a teacher. You're also going to read about Mr. Falker, which is another amazing true story about how a teacher influenced the student's ability to learn and how the student saw herself and her abilities. Really beautiful stories. I think you'll love them a lot. And then finally, we're going to tie this into the California standards for the teaching profession. So don't confuse this with the state standards for content. That is different. The California standards for the teaching profession are something that you are going to have to adhere to. You will be asked at the beginning of each school year to set goals for yourself within these standards and to acknowledge the different levels at which you are expected to grow as a professional. So first, we are responsible for engaging and supporting all students in learning. This means that we are really paying attention to what's going on with all of our students. We are assessing formally, informally. We are constantly looking to make sure that our teaching is reaching our students. And that means all. And that's going to be a big component of understanding this particular standard, is that we need to focus on all students. So if we have to reach out to the struggling students, then that is an especially important part of this, because we need to make sure that everyone is included. Next, creating and maintaining effective environments for student learning. This refers mostly to our classroom environment. And I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but if you don't, it's going to be a big part of your teaching is the classroom that you maintain. What's on the walls? How does it speak to the students? How do they interact with it? Do they see their work on the walls? Do they feel proud when they come in the classroom? Do they come in and have some role in the classroom that makes them feel connected? Depending on the grade level, you're going to have all different ways of doing this, but effective. Again, you're going to be observing and watching and seeing how your students react and making adjustments as necessary. But this is really important, and you'll probably want to make some goals for yourself in this area. Understanding and organizing subject matter for student learning. This is probably one of the hardest things to do as a new teacher, is that knowing how to put the subject matter together, because you are experts at the subject matter itself. You know what you need to do. How to do it is a very challenging thing. And so you're going to go through a learning curve at the beginning, but eventually you will get better at knowing how to best organize the subject matter for your students. And you might find that you even rearrange some things that are arranged in books or things like that, and it might work better for you, but you will become an expert at that. But don't be afraid to try new things and do things a little differently to evaluate how that works. Planning instruction and designing learning experiences for all students. That really goes along with organizing it, but this is the more specific part of the actual instruction. How are we going to vary it? How are we going to make sure that we're reaching all of our students. And it's about bringing in all those different ways of teaching. Assessing student learning, this is going to be formal and informal assessment. Informal, of course, is just that way of looking at them. Maybe it's a project. Maybe it's watching how they're responding to information. Maybe it's asking them some questions just in a group setting that don't have any real meaning in terms of grade, but have a lot of meaning in terms of how you can interact with them and see what they understand. Assessing, and then finally developing as a professional educator. This is an especially important part for all teachers because you have to maintain that standard of lifelong learning. You have to constantly grow, and you want to demonstrate this for your students as well. You want to be a lifelong learner so you can say to them, this is important, this matters. You should also be a lifelong learner. So the development that's available to you is significant. And I would encourage you, especially as social studies teachers, to seek out opportunities to grow. There are organizations that specialize in this sort of thing. There is an organization called FTE. You can find them at fte.org. It's the Foundation for Teaching Economics. And they incorporate economic concepts into every grade level, and they have amazing programs that teachers can participate in. Another one that's social studies specific is Gilder Lerman, I believe that's the correct spelling. And they provide institutes for teachers. And as social science teachers, there are just many, many things available to you. Mount Vernon in Washington's home in Virginia has programs, week-long residential programs for teachers that offer education and all kinds of amazing opportunities to really interact with history. So my advice to you as educators is take advantage of this opportunity to develop. There are so many organizations out there that are all about making teachers great teachers by giving them great experiences. And I can't even begin to tell you all of the amazing things I've been able to do as part of different organizations. So I strongly encourage you to look for these opportunities, and this is a big one. Don't overlook that. You are a big part of the process of demonstrating to your students how important learning is. Finally, there's a quote here from Hayam Gino, and he says a few things about his presence as a teacher in the classroom. I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. Decisive element. And I like the use of the word element because it is a force in the classroom that cannot be denied. The teacher, the mood, everything the teacher brings to the classroom is the primary focus of learning, the primary mover of learning in the classroom. And if this doesn't sound familiar to you, think back on your education. Perhaps you have children and they've had a teacher that really motivated them. But look at these experiences that you've had and think about this. Do you have a favorite teacher? Was there somebody who, when they walked in the classroom, made it possible for you to learn, no matter what the subject? I am not a science girl, but I will tell you I had a biology teacher in 10th grade that for some reason, because of that teacher, I was able to learn and I was willing to learn biology. And I bet you everybody has an experience like that where they can point to a teacher and say, it doesn't matter the topic, that person inspired me. And so I like that this quote points that out, that the teacher is the decisive element. He goes on to say, my personal approach creates the climate. Again, there's that idea that it's an all-inclusive ecosystem. My daily mood makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. And this is poetic in its truth and in its style. This is so true. Again, go back to your experiences. Who were the teachers that really motivated you? And what was it about them? And I guarantee it was their attitude toward what they did for a living. It was their love of a subject matter. I have another favorite teacher that I can think of, and it was my English teacher who, even though I wasn't crazy about it, he loved Shakespeare. Loved it. Absolutely could not get enough Shakespeare, but his love of Shakespeare somehow permeated into the brains of thousands of students over the years. And that has a lot to do with learning, the teacher's attitude toward it. And you could also point out that teachers can be a force for, a negative experience. Teachers who come in a bad mood, who say the wrong thing one time only, can change a child's life. So, not to scare you, but it's so important how we interact with our students. It's so important to know how they view us and how important we are to them, and how that experience they have just maybe in their 4th or 5th grade year can change their whole lives. And then finally, he says, in all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized. Again, how we treat them. And if you think back to a moment in your own life where a teacher made the difference, for better or for worse, hopefully for better, but if you have an experience where a teacher really did harm, hopefully you can take that in and learn from it and remember how that affected you and not to continue that. So as you go through this week's lessons, I hope that you'll keep these words in mind, that you'll remember the importance that you have in the lives of your students, and understand the role that each of you serves in the teaching and learning process. Until next time.